The Bush administration's push to force mental screening on especially young people, people before they get into school and while they're in school, that has the potential of doing the same thing, of putting a diagnosis on somebody's record, which if those become computerized and centralized, same thing could happen to them that's happened to veterans. Now, let's stop right here. And what's happened to veterans and what could happen to all these other people with these fancy sounding diagnoses that really are quite meaningless in most cases. The experience that we have with veterans who've been diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder, which is one of the main triggers for putting them in the no-gun list, this experience goes back to Vietnam. Men have been diagnosed with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, for quite some time. And we know that all through this time, plus the Iraq War veterans, the present war veterans from Iraq, as well as I guess we call it the Gulf War back in the early 90s, these men don't commit violent crime against themselves or other people any more than do anybody else, other groups in the population. So to use that diagnosis as a trigger for getting them removed from the list of people who can own guns is adding injury to injury. I couldn't even call it insult to injury, because it's an injury to have no due process, and then it's an injury to be stigmatized with a diagnosis that means nothing at all about how dangerous you are going to be, even possibly, unless we're willing to accept that these kinds of diagnoses are so good that surely somebody might have concluded that Mother Teresa could have been a danger to herself or to others. This is absolutely preposterous, and yet this is what we've now got built in to America's law, and those who are having their mental screening, if you will, done by these school, who knows, social workers, not even medical doctors probably in most cases, they could end up joining the ranks of the veterans, and we could be looking at millions and millions of people who have been disqualified without due process and for no good reason other than some gun grabber thought this was a really neat way to come in gun control and slice off a little bit at a time right through the back door, nobody even watching.
So you think this move against the veterans is just the nose of the camel in the tent?
The move against the veterans is almost certainly the nose of the camel getting into the tent, because mission creep is inherent to all government programs, and the only way to control them is to turn off the money. The one thing we know about government programs is bureaucrats don't volunteer.
That's good. All right, let's talk a little bit about concealed carry. How many states allow it, and do you see a potential for the federal government to try to outlaw the right to keep a concealed weapon?
There's probably some 37 states now that have what we call in the Second Amendment community shall issue laws, meaning if you have submitted to the background check, which we don't think you should have to do, and neither does the state of Vermont or the state of Alaska, there you just get a gun, put it in your purse, put it in your pocket, and you're good to go. No questions asked, no permissions from the government. But in the case of these other states, you've got systems set up where if you're not found to have a criminal record, then they must give you a permit. It's not a question any longer, as it was in most of these states prior, whether or not some police officer, whether some judge, whether some clerk thinks you might need a gun and you might have a valid reason for carrying it. The assumption now is that if you want to carry a gun for self-defense and you happen to work in an office where it doesn't have a, it's not like out in the streets in a drug neighborhood or something, so what? It's not the government's business, and they've got to give you that permit, and you've got to be allowed to carry. What we're finding is that, especially a number of the laws that were most recently enacted, governors one was infamous, and that was Governor Taft, who himself was a criminal, and he was convicted of graft, and yet he had the audacity, while as governor, and after those convictions, which didn't put him in jail unhappily, so he stayed as governor, he was able to tell the legislature, nope, I'm going to keep raising the bar, make it more and more difficult for the law to pass, for the law to make any difference as to whether you could carry it anywhere outside maybe the middle of the street while you're out in public. And so the law in Ohio is much more restrictive than some of the other laws that were passed earlier, say in the state of Virginia, or that had been on the books even before the modern movement in New Hampshire and places like that. But all in all, I would say we've seen progress, that people have been encouraged to carry guns to protect themselves when the laws were changed to make it easier for them to do so legally. And that's in turn built a political base of people who understand and support pro-Second Amendment legislation.
There are incidents recently where somebody who had a gun, concealed carry probably, was able to stop somebody from killing others. Would you comment on that?
Just before you and I began this conversation, I read of a man in Houston a day or two ago, had been assaulted by 3 robbers. The man pulled out his own gun, killed one, and the other 2 are now in captivity. This man could well have not only lost his money, but with 3 assailants against one, good possibility he could have been hurt or killed. And this happens fairly frequently. And one of the things that we should point out is that we hear an argument every time that concealed carry is introduced in a state or is being considered for loosening up the laws to make it easier for people to carry in more places. And we're always warned with alarmist rhetoric that guns in people, guns in students, guns in school, guns in churches, guns in whatever, fill in the blank, are so dangerous. And this is going to lead to road rage. It's going to lead to turning these places red with blood flowing from irresponsible activity. It never happens. In fact, what we find out is the people who have concealed carry permits are the ones who commit the fewest crimes of any group in the population, and that includes police, or ministers for that matter. These are the good guys of America and gals that have these permits, and we should be encouraging them to be carrying in churches so that they can respond the way the volunteer security detail of the church members in the New Life Church in Colorado Springs were able to respond and stop a killer literally dead in his tracks before he was able to kill what, if we judge by the ammunition he was carrying, would have been hundreds of people. People who can defend themselves can do things like that when they are there keeping a law that says no guns. Well, that's fine. Peaceful citizens generally obey those laws even when they're stupid and deadly, but criminals seem to look at them as opportunity zones where they're going to be safe. And so we have been working to encourage legislatures to back off of these no-gun zones because they're simply criminal safe zones.